What about Federal Aviation Authority regulations? Do they limit what you can do?
So the FAA heavily controls drones, as you can imagine. There have been some things in the press in the United States in the last month around, drones, and nobody knows whose drone they belong to. So, you know, our drone partner very knowledgeable around the FAA regulations. As part of this federal grant, we had a liaison at the FAA for us to have conversations with around what we were attempting to do, the guardrails within which we needed to operate, whether that was what medications we could carry, whether that was um, how far we could fly. For drones, there are different waivers that you can apply for that dictate how far you can fly a drone. It starts off as the more unrestricted, which is visual line of sight within 2 miles, and then the next stage is up to 5 miles, and then there's some that are beyond that. So the FAA heavily regulates what you can do. That being said, there's not a commercial airport on the Eastern Shore, and obviously commercial airline are flying much higher than we are. But as a hospital, we had to be very sensitive to helicopters that may be coming into our helipad to medically evacuate patients. And so we did have very tight communication with our emergency medical response personnel in the area. We let them know the dates and the times we would be flying. We had a process where if there was the need for a medical evacuation and we needed to pause the drone operations, we had tight communication around that. So that was part of the work we did related to the helicopter situation. It's not that common at that hospital that we have helicopters coming and going, but it does happen. The other thing in this rural area that we have to be concerned about was it's a very agricultural area, and as such, there are planes that do crop dusting and that type of thing. And so early on in the process, as we were developing our model, we engaged with the pilots at the local, on the local level, especially those that may have been voicing concerns around, low flying drones. Their planes fly low to do crop dusting, and how do we make sure that we understand their needs and they understand our needs? And so it was a little contentious to start, but I think once they understood what we were doing, that we were doing this in a pilot manner, that it would be very well orchestrated and planned and on very specific days, since again it's a pilot, we were able to bridge that relationship and worked very collaboratively with them through the pilot.
This is a very interesting project. Where do you go from here? What economies of scale are going to be needed to make this work?
So the work isn't done yet. I think we've learned a number of things from the pilot, and we are coming up to the end of phase one funding, and we will be applying for phase two funding, as well as looking at other grants, because we're not to a point where this process is fine-tuned enough to be commercialized and be able to pay for it, because drones are very expensive. And it's really understanding and getting the waivers from the FAA and really building a model that has scale, because that's what will make it viable from a commercial perspective. And so where we've gotten to this point is we know that we can successfully deliver medications to patients within that 5 mile radius of our hospital. So that, we have proven that many times. We've delivered to the patients that enrolled in the pilot, over the last 18 months. We've had routine deliveries every 90 days to those individuals. So we know that we can do that. Now, with that being said, one thing everybody needs to understand about drones is they're very weather dependent. They cannot fly above, in certain windy conditions, for example. So it's not quite as straightforward as getting in a car and driving something somewhere. So that's why I think these proof of concepts are so important to understand the parameters and when these drones can fly. Relative to the work we're doing on Tangier Island, that is not as well developed because there are still constraints with the waiver we have from the FAA on what we can carry. So the waiver to this point has not allowed us to carry patient-specific filled medications to the Eastern Shore. But what it has allowed us to do is deliver medical supplies. So stock medications that we use in our clinic. So we have delivered medications that we use in our clinic. And I think more importantly, because this was also part of our long-term goal, and we've successfully done this several times now, is bring back laboratory blood tubes from our clinic there to the hospital to be able to get same-day results. Because one of the other barriers that we face on that island is the only way to get there is by plane or boat, ferry or plane. We have a physician that flies out at least once a month, and traditionally he would bring back the lab samples. And so if you needed to get a diagnostic lab test, you got it done once a month because that's when the samples came back, which could be a barrier. You may need a lab sample sooner than once a month. The other, way that we get supplies and things out there and back is by the ferry. And there are certain times of the year the ferry either doesn't run, the ferry sometimes breaks down. It can be bad weather and the ferry doesn't go. So there's a lot of inconsistencies in how things come and go to Tangier. So the idea is the drone could actually expand beyond medication delivery and do other types of functions. The reason the FAA, based on our existing waiver, which is not a full waiver to go that 17 miles, it doesn't allow us to do anything that they would consider to be commercial trade. And they would consider delivering a filled prescription to a patient as commercial trade. And so us delivering supplies to our own clinic is not considered commercial trade because it's all owned by the same organization. But us delivering to a patient a filled prescription from the pharmacy, the FAA considers that commercial trade. So at this point, we've not been able to leverage that yet.
And my last question, has this project been worthwhile? And would you recommend that colleagues with a similar problem go down this route as well?
I think it's been worthwhile. One of the things that I learned during this, because when we started this process, there were a couple of pockets of individuals doing not the same work, but similar drone work across the country. There was a pilot out in Salt Lake City, so urban area. There was a pilot that was being done in Charlotte, North Carolina, so more urban area. But I think focusing in a rural area, we were really one of the first that I'm aware of that started doing some of that work. And I think there's great potential, especially in medically underserved rural areas. I think the challenges that we face in a rural area are very different than what an urban area may face. I think the other thing is having not only that seed money funding from the federal government was so critical in order to get us where we have gotten in such a small period of time. Because when I talk to some of my colleagues across the country that were perhaps doing this with more limited grant funding, we were able to do far more deliveries in a short period of time than they were able to do in several years, because we had the ability to bring together a really strong collaborative team to, I would say, fast start the process. I think there's been a lot of learning. I never thought I would have learned as much about FAA waivers as I have. But I think, understanding what some of the limitations are going to be and things we need to navigate and perhaps things we need to advocate for, right? Because, advocacy sometimes just because a regulation's in place doesn't mean that you can't advocate to have it changed. So I think that advocacy. So I would definitely, and we would like to get phase 2 funding to take this to the next level. And one of our goals going into this, and it's really one of the goals that the Department of Transportation had, was not only, for us to be able to impact our community, but to really develop a roadmap for others and share that forward so that others coming behind us could really get to our point even quicker, because they would understand a lot of whatever the challenges were, the regulations were, whatever, that we could really give others a blueprint. In fact, we're working with a collaborative in Maryland that got phase 1 funding about a year and a half after us. They just got phase 1 funding. It's a similar project. They're not that far distance from us, just one state up. And we're collaborating with them to get them further than we got in phase 1 by sharing all of our learning so that they could then start almost at the next step and take the learning further.
Cindy Williams, thank you very much for talking to us about this fascinating topic. That really has been terrifically interesting and inspiring. For more information about the work described in this interview, please visit our website using the links in the description, and be sure to subscribe for more news, videos, journals, and podcasts. For updates straight to your inbox, please follow the links below. And thanks for watching.